Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, looters, ship desolations, search, peasants, vassals. Well, I'm a useful idiot, and I'm very excited today because it's raining. And just to tip off the NSA and everybody else that's listening, yes, I live here in Seattle, Washington, and it hasn't rained for 3 months. So I'm very excited. It's raining today. But that said, I want to talk about Afghanistan. And of course, the traditional title, Graveyard of Empires, is very apropos. And a look over their history will tell you why they are called the Graveyard of Empires. And I'm doing this topic because we've hit a milestone in a number of ways of 2,000 U.S. military deaths in Afghanistan in 12 years of war. So, 2 striking anniversaries. And of course, if we count all of the coalition NATO forces killed in Afghanistan, the number's more like 8,000 total. And then, of course, we have lots of civilian deaths, up to 12,000, and also militants who will remain unnumbered. But we look at our war here 12 years later and have to ask, well, what do we have to show for it? The opium and heroin trade has rebounded. They have some sort of quasi-legitimate puppet government that needs a lot of security. And we have concentration camp-like conditions at hospitals there. Extreme brutality in the field. A bond between the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda now. And as soon as we're gone, it will return back to its normal state. But of course, we won't be gone because regardless of when U.S. troops pull out, just like in Iraq, we will have a large force of contractors, mercenaries, and private security firms there to make sure U.S. presence remains. And I'm also marking this occasion because I've been thinking a lot about the green on blue violence with Afghan police and soldiers turning on their puppet masters, the U.S. soldiers. And it's a shame that more of a bond can't be created by those troops in the field. And I'm sure there's plenty of examples where these bonds are made. But this is a tragic turn of events, but not surprising. And that's where I'm going to talk about the big picture. And I hope I can pull this off without being too tedious. But I think historically, when you look at Afghanistan, you'll see why they can't be fixed. Certainly not the way that we want to fix them. And we will continue to see more green on blue violence and a very rocky relationship with this country. They do not like occupiers, and they have proven that for 300, 400, 500 years. And of course, the Persians, the Mongols, and Muslims all attempted to conquer Afghanistan. And so let's just jump right into their history. I'm going to concentrate on the 20th century because just the 20th century alone is such a historical clusterfuck that that's impressive enough. But to put a little background, the Kingdom of Afghanistan was established in 1747. And by the 1830s, there was already the first British invasion. Then in the 1880s, there was a second British invasion. And by 1919, there was a third Anglo-Afghan war in which Afghanistan declared its independence. So Afghanistan, as the state we know today, was given independence in 1919. And by 1924, there was a bloody consolidation of power. By 1929, there was a rebellion against the monarchy. And for a while, an illiterate man surrounded by peasants and bandits was declared king. And there was a counterattack to retake the government. And Nadir Shah proclaimed king of Afghanistan. And he returned the country back to its traditional values and not modernization, where they had been headed since 1919. And then in 1930, the Soviets invaded to come after a Uzbekistan rebel, which sounds vaguely familiar. The U.S. invading Afghanistan to go after an international bandit, Osama bin Laden. Well, back in the 1930s, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to get after a rebel from Uzbekistan. Then in 1933, King Nadir Shah was assassinated and replaced by his sons. And let's also remember that in 1947, their neighbors, India and Pakistan, became independent of their colonial masters. So then we jump ahead to 1954, and a Prime Minister Dowd, who served the monarchy, asked for U.S. military assistance. And the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, Allen Dulles, said Afghanistan was of no interest to the United States. So, of course, he turned to the USSR for assistance, and Russia gave Afghanistan a $100 million line of credit. So by 1963, Prime Minister Dowd resigned, leaving King Zahir in power. And there was troops in the streets in fear of a coup back in 1963. And Prime Minister Dowd will show up again. So King Zahir takes over the show and introduces a lot of Prime Minister Dowd's ideas. He introduced a new democracy with programs of constitution, a parliament, free elections, free press. And so in 1965 they had their first free elections, but only with a 10% voter turnout, and a lot of internal struggles with the newly forming Communist Party. So by 1969, the constitutional monarchy ends, and King Zahir Shah just consolidates his power. But by 1972 and 73, just a few years later, Prime Minister Dowd comes back, plans a coup, and pulls off a successful coup in Afghanistan in 1973. So he proclaims himself president of the new Republic of Afghanistan, and that is the country that we know today. And by 1978, a communist coup began, and tanks that were protecting the presidential palace turned on the palace instead. And the palace was even bombed by planes. So then Colonel Qadar takes over, and President Dowd and all members of his family were killed. And then we have the Islamic rebellion against the communist government. So I hope you're getting a clear picture as I go through this quick rundown of their history, why this is such a quagmire. Who can hope to save a nation that spent the last 100 years involved in this sort of violence and coups and takeovers and rivalries and bloodbaths? And this is even before there's that much outside interference. So anyway, by 1979, the Islamic rebellion's going on. A U.S. ambassador is killed. Most of the army starts joining the rebels. And then the communist government calls for 4,500 Soviet advisors. And the Soviets plan assassinations. And then there's another coup. And a man named Amin takes over. And he also represents the communist government. But according to Time magazine, they said that 30,000 people were imprisoned and 2,000 executed during this Islamic rebellion against the communist government in Afghanistan. So by December 12, 1979, that is when the Russian invasion began. Amin was killed, and a puppet government set up, and he requested the Soviet army to put down the Islamic rebellion. So I'm not sure if a lot of people know that the purpose of Soviet troops was to go in and support a communist government, secular government, that was anti-religion against an Islamic rebellion in Afghanistan. So no wonder Ronald Reagan would characterize them later as noble freedom fighters. So now that they are turned on us, somehow they are less noble and not interested in freedom. They're merely fighters. So the Soviet army puts down the rebellion for the Afghanistan government. And nearly 70,000 Afghan army troops of an army of 100,000 actually defect to the Mujahideen. And then, of course, by early 1980s, the U.S. is working with those same Mujahideen resistance groups, and the CIA is supporting them. And oddly enough, the CIA was working with these Mujahideen groups in Pakistan and sending them into Afghanistan. And now we're in Afghanistan sending troops to attack positions in Pakistan. So anyway, back to our story. By 1985, Reagan called the Afghans heroes of freedom and champions of the free world. And in fact, we have a National Afghanistan Day in the U.S., March 21st. And so anyway, a little known history there. So in 1988, the Soviets pull out of Afghanistan after 9 years, and the communist government, 3 years later, falls to the Mujahideen. And then the Civil War continues all through the 90s, and then we have this split off into renegade generals and warlords controlling their own districts. And that gets us closer to where we are now. So the Mujahideen finally defeat the communists, there's a civil war, and then we have the country partitioned into warlord and renegade general zones. And it's in this vacuum that the Taliban take over with their religious fundamentalism, which had a lot of appeal to a obviously very religious Afghan Muslim culture that goes back a couple hundred, 300, 400 years. And so by the late 90s, the Northern Alliance, a organized rebellion, and this is where Hamid Karzai, the present premier of Afghanistan, comes from. He was part of this Northern Alliance, and that was made up of people forced out of the original monarchy who continued to rebel against the Taliban. So anyway, and then we end up with the U.S. invasion in 2001, and here we are. So the U.S. invasion in 2001, and 11 years later, 12 years later, we are still there, and we're going to be there for 2 more years, and ostensibly we are going to be in there for longer than that. So was it worth it? That is the question. And here we are in Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, and certainly between Iraq and Afghanistan, they have drained the United States of blood and treasure, and we will see if Afghanistan will be the graveyard of the American empire. I'm Useful Idiot. Don't you be one too.